They chained their own father in a cellar for more than a year, and when the authorities uncovered the truth, even the most hardened judges shuddered. But before I tell you how two sisters turned their family home into a secret prison in the heart of Provence in 1877, tell me, where are you listening to this story from right now? From Paris, from Lyon, or perhaps from the other side of the world? Leave a comment with your city. And if you're fascinated by true stories, the most disturbing in French history, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear today will chill your blood to the very last minute. This story is not a legend. It is written in the judicial archives of Dean Les Bains, and it begins with a storm. Autumn of 77 struck the province with unusual violence. The vineyards of Saint-Aubin, that little village lost between Dean and Manosque, bent beneath the gusts of wind. The dirt paths turned into muddy torrents, and the peasants shut their shutters, whispering prayers against the fury of the elements. It was in this turmoil that Anton Merville, a 28-year-old surveyor sent from Marseille to map the new cadastral parcels, was desperately searching for shelter. His horse advanced with difficulty, its hooves slipping on the soaked ground. The rain lashed his face, and night was falling quickly over the Provençal hills. At the turn of a road lined with twisted trees bent by the wind, Anton finally saw a glimmer. A massive, isolated gray stone house whose thick walls seemed to defy time. The Delaunus estate. He had heard of it in the village. A reclusive family, two sisters living alone for years, avoiding any contact with the inhabitants of Saint-Aubin. Anton knocked on the heavy wooden door. Once, twice, nothing. He pounded harder, shouting above the roar of the storm. "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." After what felt like an eternity, the door opened slightly. A woman of about 35 appeared in the doorway, an oil lamp trembling in her hand. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her dark eyes examined him with almost hostile suspicion. It was Emilie Delaunus, the elder of the two surviving sisters. "What do you want?" she asked coldly, without opening the door any wider. "I'm a surveyor, madam. The storm caught me on the road to Manosque. My horse is exhausted. I beg you, just let me stay under shelter until dawn. I'll pay for the trouble." Emilie hesitated. Behind her, a softer voice was heard, the voice of Colette, the younger one, 32 years old. "Emilie, we can't leave him outside in this weather. Mother wouldn't have wanted that." Emilie stiffened at the mention of their mother, but finally stepped back, opening the door just enough to let Anton pass. "Come in quickly and make no noise." The inside of the house was as austere as the outside. Bare stone walls, a few old pieces of furniture, a smell of dampness mixed with beeswax. A massive crucifix dominated the living room, and several holy images hung on the walls. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Colette appeared with a blanket and a bowl of hot soup. She was slighter than her sister, with delicate features marked by a constant sadness. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed the bowl to Antoine. "Thank you so much," he said with a smile. "You're saving my life." "It's only temporary," Emilie cut in sharply. "You'll sleep in the storeroom and leave at dawn. We do not receive men here." Antoine nodded, too grateful to argue. But as he ate his soup in silence, a strange sound reached his ears, a dull, muffled moan that seemed to come from below. He looked up and met Colette's eyes, now wide with panic, her face turning pale. "What was that?" he asked instinctively. "The wind," Emilie snapped, placing herself between him and the staircase leading down to the cellar. "The old houses always make strange noises during storms. You should go to bed now, Monsieur Merville." Anton Merville. "Monsieur Merville, Colette will show you to the shed." But Anton had lived through too many storms to mistake the howling of the wind for what he had just heard. It was not the wind. It was a human voice, pleading, desperate. That night, unable to sleep in the freezing shed, Anton quietly made his way back toward the house. The storm had calmed, replaced by a light, persistent drizzle. Through a ground-floor window, he saw Emily descending a narrow staircase, holding a lamp and a tray of food. She disappeared into what appeared to be a cellar. A few minutes later, muffled voices echoed, a man's voice, broken, begging, then Emily's harsh, accusing. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. There was someone else in that house, someone who was not supposed to be seen. When Emily came back up, Anton hid behind a bush. She locked a trapdoor in the hallway floor with a padlock, then went upstairs. The house fell silent again. The next morning, Anton left the property as agreed, but his mind was haunted by what he had heard. When he reached Saint-Aubin, he went straight to the gendarmerie. Brigadier Gustave Renard, a man in his 50s, with a thick mustache and eyes worn by 30 years of service, listened to his story with obvious skepticism. Noises in a cellar during a storm, Monsieur Merville. Old houses always do that. I know what I heard, Brigadier, Anton insisted. It wasn't the wind, it was a man. And I saw one of the sisters going down with food, then locking a trapdoor with a padlock. Why lock a cellar from the outside? Renard rubbed his chin thoughtfully. The Delanis family has always been strange. It was true. Since the death of Thérèse Delanis, the wife, 15 years earlier, the patriarch Armand had grown even more reclusive. Then, a little over a year ago, he had completely vanished from the village streets. The sisters claimed he had left to live in a monastery near Avignon, seeking redemption after a life of sin. "You know anything about that family?" Anton asked. "Not much," admitted Renard. "Father Armand Delanis was a lay preacher, a hard man, obsessed with the Bible and sin. After his wife's death, he became difficult. People said he held strange sermons in his home, talking about purification and sacrifice. There were 3 daughters, yes, 3. Suzanne, the eldest, she died about 5 years ago. No one really knows of what. The other 2 never left that house and nobody thought much of it." Renard shrugged wearily. "Monsieur Merville, this is Provence, not Paris. Families live how they like, unless someone files a complaint." "I'm filing one now," said Anton firmly. "You must investigate. Someone is being held in that cellar, I'm certain of it." The brigadier sighed, but Anton's conviction was too strong to ignore. And that detail, the locked trapdoor, gnawed at him. "Very well," he said at last. "We'll go this afternoon. But I warn you, if you've made me waste my time with ghost stories, you'll answer for it." That afternoon, October 3rd, 1877, Brigadier Renard, accompanied by Gendarme Mathieu Blanc and Anton Merville, arrived at the door of the Delanis house. The autumn sun filtered through the clouds, casting long shadows over the surrounding vineyards. A cool wind rustled the plane trees lining the property. Emily opened the door. Her face hardened instantly at the sight of the uniforms. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice tense. "Mademoiselle Delanis," said Renard. "I'm Brigadier Renard. We've received a complaint about unusual noises coming from your property. We must inspect the premises." "A complaint," she repeated, throwing a furious glance at Anton. "That's absurd. There's nothing here that—" "Mademoiselle," Renard interrupted firmly, "you can cooperate or I'll return with a warrant from the Justice of the Peace in Dean. Which would you prefer?" Colette appeared behind her sister, pale-faced. her hands nervously twisting her apron. "Emily," she whispered in a trembling voice, "maybe we should." "Be quiet," hissed Emily. But it was too late. The brigadier had seen the panic in Colette's eyes, and the way she glanced toward the corridor leading to the back of the house. There was definitely something to hide. "We're coming in," declared Renard, pushing past Emily firmly. The two sisters had no choice but to let them in. The interior of the house was exactly as Anton remembered it, austere, oppressive, frozen in time. Renard advanced down the corridor, followed by Blanc and Anton. Emily and Colette stayed behind, Colette silently crying while Emily clenched her fists so tightly her knuckles whitened. Emily stood rigid, her jaw clenched. "Where is the cellar?" asked Renard. Silence. Then Colette, in a broken voice. "Over there, the trapdoor under the carpet." Emily shot her a murderous glare, but said nothing. Renard lifted the worn carpet, revealing, indeed, a heavy wooden trapdoor secured with a sturdy padlock. "The key," he ordered. Emily didn't move. It was Colette who, trembling, pulled a key from her pocket and handed it to the brigadier. Renard unlocked the padlock and lifted the trapdoor, revealing a stone staircase descending into darkness. A nauseating stench rose up, a mix of mold, urine, and something else, something indefinably human, abandoned. "Good God," murmured Blanc, stepping back. Renard lit a lamp and began to descend, followed by the others. The steps were slick with damp. The deeper they went, the more unbearable the smell became. At last they reached the cellar floor. What the lamplight revealed was beyond anything Anton had imagined. In the center of the vaulted room, sitting on the wet stone floor, was a man, or what was left of one. So thin he was almost skeletal, his skin grayish and covered in sores, his hair long and matted, his beard wild. His wrists and ankles were bound by heavy chains fixed into the stone wall. He wore what had once been a white shirt, now torn and filthy, and trousers reduced to rags. Beside him sat a bucket filled with excrement, a nearly empty water jug, and pieces of moldy bread. Against the opposite wall, dozens of notebooks were stacked, some open, their pages covered in frantic, cramped writing. The man slowly lifted his head toward the light. His eyes, once perhaps lively, were now sunken, glassy, empty. He opened his mouth, but only a raspy moan escaped. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," whispered Renard, horrified. "Who are you?" The man struggled to speak, his voice a cracked whisper. "Armand, Armand Delanis, deliver me. I have done nothing. God is my witness." Anton felt his stomach twist. It was the father, the very father the sisters claimed had gone to a monastery. He was there in that foul cellar, chained like an animal for more than a year. Blanc rushed toward him, trying to unfasten the chains, but they were solidly secured. "We need tools, quickly." Renard climbed back up the stairs, followed by Anton. In the hallway, Emily and Colette had not moved. Emily's face was still defiant. Colette had collapsed into a chair, sobbing into her hands. "The keys to the chains," barked Renard. "There aren't any," replied Emily coldly. "We threw them into the well 6 months ago." You did this to your own father," murmured Anton, stunned. For the first time, emotion crossed Emily's face, a cold, ancient rage that seemed to burn her from within. "Our father," she spat. "That man was no father. He was a monster, a wolf disguised as a shepherd, and we did what he deserved." Renard shook his head, appalled. I'm placing you both under arrest. Gendarme Blanc, stay with the prisoner. I'll send for Marshal Ferrin to cut those chains. And you too, he said, turning to the sisters, will explain exactly what happened here. While Blanc went back down for water and blankets for Armand, Renard sat the two sisters in the parlor. Colette was slumped, unable to speak, but Emilie sat upright, eyes fixed, unflinching. Talk, ordered Renard. Why did you do this? Emilie took a long breath, her voice trembling with contained anger. You want to know why? Fine. I'll tell you what that man did. For 15 years, since our mother's death, he kept us prisoners. Not with chains, no, with fear, with threats, with the Bible twisted to justify his acts. He said he acted in God's name, that he had to purify his daughters, that he must keep us in virtue by any means. Her voice cracked slightly, but she went on. He started with Susan, the eldest, night after night. She was 15 when Mother died, 15. And he said it was his mission, that God had commanded him to protect us from sin. When Emilie reached this point, Colette burst into convulsive sobs. Emilie placed a trembling hand on her sister's shoulder, her own eyes glistening with restrained tears, and continued. She died in childbirth at 23, the baby too. And he didn't even cry. He said it was God's will, that she was paying for her sins. Renard and Antine listened, petrified with horror. Emilie continued, her tone now mechanical, as if reciting a memorized litany. After Susan, it was my turn, then Colette. For years we couldn't leave. We had no money, nowhere to go. And who would have believed us? Him, the respected preacher, against us, his disobedient daughters. She lifted her gaze toward Renard, her eyes hard, cold, defiant. So we waited, we planned. And a year ago we acted. The cellar, under the pretext of fixing a leak. Colette struck him with a wooden beam as he descended, and we chained him with the same chains he kept in the attic, the ones he used to threaten us with whenever we disobeyed. Mademoiselle Delanne, murmured Renard in a low voice, what you describe, if true, you had no right to take justice into your own hands. You should have gone to the authorities. Emilie let out a bitter laugh, empty of joy. The authorities, like you, Brigadier. You who saw nothing for 15 years, who never asked questions when Susan died, when we stopped leaving the house. Renard lowered his eyes, unable to answer. She was right. No one had seen, or rather, no one had wanted to see. Dr. Bertrand Morel arrived from Dean 2 hours later, accompanied by Marshal Ferrin, who finally managed to cut the chains. Armand Delanne was brought up from the cellar, barely conscious, delirious with fever and dehydration. He was laid in a room upstairs, watched over by Gendarme Blanc while the doctor examined him. The diagnosis was grim: severe malnutrition, multiple infections, probable pneumonia, and a mind deeply shattered. His chances of survival were slim. This man should have been dead months ago, said Dr. Morel to Renard in the hallway. The fact that he's still alive is inexplicable. Either they gave him just enough to keep him alive, or he has an extraordinary constitution. Or both, replied Renard darkly. Meanwhile, Anton and Renard returned to the cellar to examine the notebooks they had seen earlier. There were dozens, some old, others recent. Renard opened one at random and began reading aloud. May 15th, 1876. The Lord spoke to me this night. He told me that the flesh is weak, but the spirit may be saved through discipline. I must continue my work. Emilie still resists, but she will understand as Susan eventually understood. God wants me to keep them pure. It is my burden, my cross to bear. Anton felt nausea rise. Renard turned to another notebook, more recent. March 3rd, 1877. They dared strike me. My own daughters, raised in the fear of God, have turned against me. They have chained me in this cellar as if I were a criminal, but I know the truth. This is a trial sent by the Lord. Like Job, I must endure. They will come to their senses. They will see that I was right. Page after page, the notebooks revealed the twisted mind of Armand Delon. He justified each abominable act through distorted biblical quotes, convincing himself he was fulfilling a divine mission. More recently, locked away in the cellar, his writings had grown even more delirious, frantic prayers, accusations against his daughters, apocalyptic prophecies. In one of the last notebooks, dated September 1877, just a few weeks earlier, he wrote, "They let me die, but God will avenge his faithful servant. They shall burn in hell for what they have done. I will be justified before the throne of the Most High. My sins are nothing compared to theirs." Renard closed the notebook, his face pale. My God, this man was completely insane. Was, asked Antoine. He's still alive, isn't he? Physically, maybe, but his mind, there's nothing human left in it. They went back upstairs, carrying several notebooks as evidence. In the sitting room, Emilie and Colette were waiting, guarded by another gendarme who had come from the village. Emilie stared at the wall with a blank expression, while Colette wept softly. Renard sat opposite them, placing the notebooks on the table. "I've read some of his confessions," he said quietly. "If what he wrote is true—" "It's true," interrupted Emilie in a dull voice. "Every word, every horror, all of it is true." "Then why didn't you come to us? Why do this?" For the first time, Emilie's armor cracked. Tears rolled down her cheeks, which she wiped away furiously. "Because we were afraid, because no one would have believed us, because even if they did, what would have happened? He'd have a trial, maybe a few years in prison, and then he'd come back. He'd find us, and he'd kill us." Her voice rose, trembling with hysteria. "You don't understand. That man was obsessed. He truly believed he was right. He thought God was speaking to him. Even locked in that cellar, he kept writing, praying, convincing himself of his innocence. How do you stop someone like that?" Renard had no answer, because deep down he knew she was probably right. The justice of the time was not kind to women accusing respectable men, even with proof. And Armand Delon, despite his madness, had always been seen as a pious man, eccentric perhaps, but respectable nonetheless. "There's something else you must see," said Colette suddenly in a faint voice. She rose unsteadily and led them upstairs to a room locked with a key. Emilie hesitated, then took out another key and opened the door. The room was small, almost a cell. A narrow bed, a nightstand, a crucifix on the wall. But on the table there was another notebook, older, the handwriting different. Colette handed it to Renard. It was Suzanne's. She had started writing when everything began. She wanted to leave a trace in case something happened to her. Renard opened the notebook carefully. The handwriting was that of a young girl, round, neat at first, then more and more chaotic as the pages went on. November 12, 1862. Papa came into my room again tonight. He says it's for my own good, that God has shown him the path to keep me pure. I tried to tell him no, but he says I don't understand, that I'm too young, that I'll understand later. It hurts. I want Mama. Why did she leave? Why did she abandon us with him?" Antoine turned away, unable to keep reading. Renard continued, page after page. the atrocious story of a young girl trapped, abused by her own father, unable to escape. The final entries, dating from 1872, spoke of her pregnancy, her terror, her despair. July 15th, 1872. The baby moves now. I don't want this baby. I don't want this life. But Papa says I must accept it, that it's God's will. Sometimes I think about jumping from the attic. It would be so easy. But Emily and Colette, I can't abandon them. Who will protect them if I go? The notebook ended abruptly in August 1872. Susan had died 3 weeks later. Renard closed the notebook, his hands trembling. He looked at the two sisters, and for the first time, he no longer saw criminals. He saw victims, victims who had become judges only because they had no other choice. "What will you do with us?" Emily asked softly. I don't know," admitted Renard. "You have committed a crime, imprisonment, torture. According to the law, you must be judged." But he didn't finish his sentence. They all knew what he meant. How could one judge these women? How could one condemn victims who had defended themselves in the only way they knew? Silence settled over the room, a heavy question with no answer. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The case of the Delans made headlines throughout all of Provence. The newspapers from Marseille, Nice, and even Paris sent reporters to Saint-Aubin. The furies of Provence, the devil's daughters, vengeance in female form. The headlines competed in sensationalism. Armand Delan died 10 days after his discovery, never having fully regained consciousness. On his deathbed, he still murmured prayers and accusations. The priest who came to give him the last rites left the room pale and shaken, refusing to reveal what the dying man had confessed. Emily and Colette were transferred to the prison of Dean Lesbanes while awaiting trial. The local population was divided. Some, especially the older and more conservative men, demanded the maximum penalty for these unnatural creatures who had dared to raise their hands against their father. Others, particularly the women and the younger ones, whispered that the Delan sisters had only done what many would have wanted to do in their place. The trial began in December in the courtroom of the Dean Courthouse. The atmosphere was electric. Dozens of onlookers had crowded into the room, and outside an even larger crowd waited for news. Judge Edouard Lafourette, a 55-year-old magistrate known for his rigor, but also for his sense of justice, presided. The prosecution was led by prosecutor Henry Duffer, an ambitious man who saw in this case an opportunity to advance his career. He presented the charges with vehemence: arbitrary confinement, torture, aggravated mistreatment, and attempted homicide. He demanded 20 years of hard labor for each of the accused. "Gentlemen of the jury," thundered Duffer, "we are faced with a crime that defies comprehension. Two daughters chained their own father in a cellar for more than a year, leaving him to rot in his filth, depriving him of food and care, condemning him to a slow and atrocious death. No matter the so-called justifications they offer, nothing, absolutely nothing, can excuse such an act of barbarity." He paused theatrically, sweeping his gaze across the room. "They claim to have acted out of vengeance for crimes their father supposedly committed, but where is the proof? A few notebooks written by a clearly unbalanced woman. The ravings of a sick mind do not constitute confessions. And even if part of what they allege were true, the law is clear. No one may take justice into their own hands. That is the very foundation of our civilization." He pointed an accusing finger toward Emily and Colette, seated at the defendant's bench. Emily's face remained impassive, but Colette wept silently. "These women are not victims, gentlemen of the jury," he continued. They are criminals, torturers, and they must be punished with the full severity of the law. The defense was assured by Maître Jules Marchand, a young lawyer from Marseille who had agreed to represent the sisters for free after reading their case file. Unlike Duffer, he spoke in a calm voice, almost softly but charged with emotion. He began. "Gentlemen of the jury," he said, "I'm not here to deny the facts. Yes, my clients imprisoned their father. Yes, they chained him in a cellar. Yes, they kept him there in inhuman conditions. These facts are established. But the question you must ask yourselves today is not did they do this? It is why did they do it?" He turned toward the jury, 8 men from the region, merchants, farmers, craftsmen. "I will tell you a story. The story of 3 little girls who lost their mother at the ages of 15, 16, and 10. 3 little girls left alone with a man who, under the guise of faith and morality, turned them into prisoners, into objects, into victims of a crime so vile that even words fail me to describe it." He seized Suzanne's notebook and held it high. "This, gentlemen, is the testimony of a dead woman. Suzanne Delaunay, the eldest, who endured 10 years of horror before dying while giving birth to her own father's child. Read these pages. Read the suffering of a young girl trapped, unable to escape, unable to cry for help because no one would have believed that the respected Pastor Delaunay could commit such acts." He set down the notebook and picked up Armand's writings. "And these are the confessions of the executioner himself, a man who justifies his crimes through the Bible, who believes himself divinely chosen, who, even in chains, even dying, refused to admit that he had done anything wrong." His voice rose slightly, vibrating with restrained indignation. The prosecutor asks, "Where is the proof?" "Here it is. Hundreds of pages written by the accused himself, detailing his actions, his thoughts, his madness, and he dares to call them the ramblings of a sick mind. But that is precisely the point. Armand Delaunay was sick with a perversion that destroyed the lives of his 3 daughters." He turned toward Emilie and Colette. "Look at them, gentlemen, look at these women. One is 35, the other 32. They have never known love, never had friends, never lived. Their entire youth was stolen by a monster who bore the name of father. And when at last they found the courage to defend themselves, when they finally did, they could have killed him. A knife, poison, an accident, no one would have asked questions. But no, they chained him. They kept him alive because deep down, despite all he had done to them, they were not murderers." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Prosecutor Duffer seemed shaken. "I'm not asking for acquittal," Marchand continued. "My clients broke the law and they admit it. But I ask for mercy. I ask that you see in them not criminals but victims who found no other way out. I ask that you understand that sometimes, when every door is closed, when every hand of help is withdrawn, human beings turn to desperate solutions." He concluded in a low voice, almost a whisper. "Gentlemen of the jury, today you have the power to deliver justice, not the blind justice of the law, but human justice, the kind that considers suffering, context, and impossibility. I beg you, do not turn these victims into criminals. They have suffered enough." The trial lasted 3 days. Witnesses came forward one after another. Brigadier Renard described the scene in the cellar, the state in which he had found Armand. Dr. Morel detailed the wounds and malnutrition. Anton Merville recounted how he had discovered the secret of the Delaunay house. Then came the sisters themselves. Colette, too fragile, could not testify for long. She collapsed in tears after the first few questions. But Emilie, she spoke in a flat, emotionless voice. She described 15 years of horror, The repeated assaults, the threats, the isolation, Suzanne's death, and finally, the decision to take revenge. "We knew it was wrong," she said simply, "but we didn't know what else to do. We were afraid he would start again, afraid he would never stop. So we stopped him ourselves." "Do you regret what you did?" asked Prosecutor Dufer. Emily looked him straight in the eye. "I regret that he didn't die sooner." A murmur swept through the courtroom. Judge Laforet called for silence. The jury retired to deliberate. 3 hours passed, then 5, then 7. Outside, the crowd waited. Bets were being made. Some predicted hanging, others acquittal. Finally, at 10 o'clock that night, the jury returned. The foreman, a farmer named Pierre Bonnard, stood up, a trembling paper in his hands. Judge Laforet asked, "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached your verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor, please read it." Bonnard swallowed hard, then read in an unsteady voice. "On the charge of unlawful confinement, guilty. On the charge of aggravated mistreatment, guilty. On the charge of attempted homicide, not guilty. However, the jury recommends leniency, in light of the exceptional circumstances that led to the acts in question." Exclamations erupted in the courtroom. Judge Laforet struck his gavel for silence, then turned toward the Delaunay sisters. "Emily and Colette Delaunay, stand up." They obeyed. Colette leaned on her sister to stay upright. "You have been found guilty of serious crimes. The law provides that such crimes may be punished with up to 20 years of hard labor. However, after carefully examining all the evidence and the circumstances of this case, and taking into account the jury's recommendation," he paused, "I sentence you to confinement in a convent of the Order of the Sisters of Mercy, where you will remain under religious supervision for an indefinite period, until the ecclesiastical authorities deem your moral rehabilitation complete. There, you will receive spiritual and psychological guidance. This is the decision of this court." It was neither the acquittal some had hoped for, nor the harsh punishment others demanded. It was a compromise, a way for justice to acknowledge both the gravity of the acts and the atrocity of the circumstances. Emily briefly closed her eyes, then nodded. Colette broke down in tears, but this time they were tears of relief. Emily and Colette Delaunay were transferred to the convent of Our Lady of Mercy, near Aix-en-Provence, in January 1878. It was a stark institution, run by strict but not unkind nuns. The sisters found a kind of peace there, a soothing routine after years of chaos and terror. Emily worked in the kitchens and tended the gardens. She spoke little, kept her distance from the other residents, but carried out her duties with mechanical diligence. At night she was haunted by nightmares, waking up screaming, seeing her father's face, hearing his deranged sermons echo in the dark. Colette, more fragile, spent her days embroidering and praying. She developed a close bond with Sister Marguerite, an elderly nun who listened without judgment. Gradually, Colette began to talk about Suzanne, about their mother, about the happy memories from before her death. For her, it was a way to rebuild something long broken. Months turned into years. France was changing, the Third Republic was taking hold, secular laws were spreading, society was evolving. But inside the convent, time seemed frozen. In 1883, 5 years after their confinement, Sister Marguerite died of pneumonia. Colette was devastated. She refused to eat for days, mourning the only person who had truly cared for her since Suzanne. Seeing her sister fade away, Emily made a decision she never thought possible. She asked to see the Mother Superior. "My sister won't survive here," she said simply. She needs to go outside to see the world, to live, even just a little. The Mother Superior, a stern but fair woman named Mother Therese, studied her carefully. "And you, Emily, what do you want?" Me, Emily was caught off guard. I don't know. I don't know what I want. I only know that Colette deserves better than this." Mother Therese slowly nodded. "You have changed. When you first arrived, you were full of anger, of hatred. Now I see someone who thinks of another before herself. That's progress." She paused. "I will write to the authorities. I can't promise anything, but I will plead your case. You have served your sentence in your own way. Perhaps you both deserve a second chance." 6 months later, in November, Emily and Colette Delaunay were officially released. They were given a small sum of money, the proceeds from the sale of their family home in Saint-Aubin, which no one had wanted to live in after the scandal, and they left the convent. They settled in Marseille, far from Provence and its ghosts. Emily found work as a seamstress in a workshop, Colette as a helper in a grocery store. They rented a small room in the Panier district, living modestly but finally free. For the first time since their adolescence, they could go out when they wished, speak to whom they pleased, live as they chose. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. Some days, Colette panicked in the streets, overwhelmed by the crowds and the noise. Other days she laughed, discovering the port, the ships, the colorful markets. Emily remained more reserved. She never married, never sought close friendships, but she watched over Colette with fierce devotion, making up for all the years she hadn't been able to protect her. Then Colette met a dockworker named Louis Roch. He was a simple man, not well educated but kind. He knew nothing of her past. Colette had only told him that her family was gone. Louis fell in love with her gentleness, her fragility. They married in 1890 in a small ceremony attended only by Emily and two of Louis's co-workers. Emily watched her sister leave with mixed emotions. She was truly happy for Colette, yet she felt abandoned. What would she do now, all alone? The answer came a few months later when a young woman appeared at her sewing workshop. Her name was Marie. She was 17 and running away from a violent husband. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter, Chinese letter. Had heard of Emily through a friend, someone who understood, someone who could help. Emily looked at that young woman, her face bruised, her eyes filled with fear, and in her, she saw Susan. She saw herself. She saw every woman who had nowhere else to go. "Stay here tonight," she said simply. "We'll find a solution tomorrow." That was the beginning of something new. Over the years, Emily became a kind of refuge for women in distress. Not officially. She had neither the means nor the authority to create an institution. But in the Panier district, people whispered that Emily Delaunay helped those who needed help. She found them work, a place to sleep, sometimes simply a listening ear. She never spoke about her own past, but those she helped could feel that she understood in a way others could not. Colette, meanwhile, had two children, a daughter in 1893 and a son in 1895. She was a loving mother, perhaps overprotective, but determined to give her children the childhood she had never known. Louis never truly knew what had happened in Saint-Aubin. Colette spoke of it only once, one night when the nightmares returned. He listened in silence, then held her close and said simply, "You're here now with me. The past is the past." It wasn't entirely true. The past never disappears completely, but it was enough. Emily died in 1919 at the age of 77 during the Spanish flu epidemic. Colette was by her bedside, holding her hand. Emily's last words were, "We survived, Colette. Despite everything, we survived. Colette lived until 1934, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She never spoke of Saint Taubin to her family. Some secrets, she decided, should die with those who carried them. But the story of the sisters Delaunay did not die. The judicial archives remained, Armand's journals were preserved, the yellowed newspaper clippings slept in libraries. And over the decades the story resurfaced, first as a morbid curiosity, then as a historical testimony, and finally as a symbol. A symbol of the violence hidden behind closed doors. A symbol of the silence that shields the abuser and condemns the victim. A symbol, too, of the desperate resistance of those who can bear no more. The Delaunay house in Saint Taubin was never lived in again. It crumbled slowly with time. The walls collapsed, the beams rotted, nature reclaimed its ground. The villagers avoided the place, especially at night. Some claimed they heard sounds, chains rattling, faint moans, prayers carried by the wind. Probably legends, probably just the wind in the ruins, the mice in the rubble, imagination running wild. But perhaps not. Perhaps some horrors leave a mark so deep that it never fades. Perhaps the house of Lonnet still keeps, somewhere in its fallen stones, the echo of what once happened there. In 1977, exactly 1 century after the events, a local historian named Jean-Claude Four published a book about the Lonnet case. He had spent years combing through archives, interviewing the last descendants and piecing together the story. His book was titled The Chains of Providence: The Lonnet Affair and Patriarchal Justice in the 19th Century. In his conclusion, Four wrote, "The story of Émilie and Colette de Lonnet forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What is justice when the law protects oppressors? What is morality when institutions look the other way? What is guilt when crime becomes the only answer to a greater crime?" A century later, we still have no satisfying answers to those questions, but we have the duty to keep asking them. Those words still resonate today, because, sadly, the story of the sisters Delaunay is not unique. It repeats itself in different forms, in different places, in different eras. Families where violence hides behind respectability, victims who are not believed, systems that fail to protect the vulnerable. The difference, perhaps, is that today we talk about it. We acknowledge these tragedies. We try imperfectly to make things right. In 2011, the town of Saint Taubin installed a memorial plaque on the site of the old Delaunay house. It bears a simple inscription: "In memory of Suzanne, Émilie, and Colette Delaunay, victims and survivors. May their story never be forgotten." It isn't much, just a bronze plaque on ruins overgrown with thorns. But it is recognition, a way of saying we see you, we believe you, you are not alone. And perhaps somewhere, whether in what we imagine as the afterlife, or simply within our collective memory, the sisters Delaunay can finally rest in peace, knowing that their story, however terrible, served a purpose. That it opened eyes. That it changed minds. Or perhaps not. Perhaps peace, after all, is impossible after such things. Such ordeals. Perhaps some wounds never heal, not even after death. But at least they survived. Against all odds, despite everything, they survived. Not the life they should have had, not the one they deserved, but a life nonetheless. Maybe that's the only possible victory in a story this dark. Night falls over Provence. The cypress trees cast long shadows across the hills. In the ruins of the old house, the wind rustles through the dead leaves. A careful passerby might hear, or think they hear, a faint metallic sound, like chains clinking in the distance. But surely it's just the wind, isn't it? If this story moved you, tell us where you're listening from in the comments. And if you want to discover more true stories that shape the history of France, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon for another story.